Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Today we have again the illustrious Darrius on the show, the web app extraordinaire, web app pen tester extraordinaire on the show. Darrius, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. And like always, man, you are hyping me up way too much.
Got to do it. Got to do it. So in this episode, we're gonna continue our series of that I initially coined as Behind the Hack. It's our day in the life series, where we're going to talk to Darrius about what life is like behind the keyboard of a web app pen tester, what it's like on a web app pen test. We're going to talk about the various parts of a web app pen test. We're going to talk about planning and preparation and execution and post exploitation, along with the common challenges that come along the way. So without further ado, Darrius, what are your thoughts on, starting a web app pen test, planning, preparation? How do you prepare? What's kind of the first stage for you?
Yeah, so I guess we can start at the planning and preparation step. So, if anyone is familiar with the pen testing process, before you can just go and start hacking on stuff, there are some preliminary steps, right? You're going to want to one, make sure that you're trained up and educated enough, and then two, you're going to have a kickoff meeting to kind of make sure that you get your scope and everything of that nature. So, for me personally, in terms of preparation, I like to stay on top of new things first and foremost. And so the way that I like to do that, it's all about training and knowledge and education and training. And so Burp Suite Academy is amazing. If you are trying to learn how to break web apps, Burp Suite Academy, in my opinion, is the best resource out there. And they also keep things up to date. There have been so many times where I will go and do a lab through them, and then I will get into an actual engagement and do the same exact thing I did on the lab, and it actually work in real life. And so, if you've been listening to the show before, that's one thing I've always complained about in terms of web app training. And Burp Suite, they really have it figured out. They keep it up to date. If you haven't checked, one of the new ones they released where was GraphQL, and that's been extremely helpful because we've seen a rise in GraphQL applications. So I think it starts there. On top of just that, I try to keep up with Cloudflare bypasses. I try to keep up with new coding practices and trends, and I do that by there's a YouTuber that I like to watch called Fireship. He's amazing. He's funny, but he also keeps it kind of succinct as far as like, hey, here's this new technology. Here's how it impacts the industry, and it's just great for keeping up with relevant topics. And then lastly, I would say reading white papers. I had someone kind of tell me this, and this has kind of really changed my game a little bit in terms of at the beginner phases you're doing a bunch of labs and things of that nature, but to go from that intermediate level to expert, one of the best things you can do is read and understand white papers. And so that's something else that I've kind of been incorporating into my preparation as well.
Yeah, and it's something that I think is a little bit underestimated, right? I tweeted something out just today about the amount of people who do not perform penetration tests on a day-to-day basis. It's quite large, right? You have IT admins and CISOs and everybody in the trenches, defending their organizations, who are not doing this day in and day out. And there's an under appreciation, or there's not a recognition of the amount of work that goes into what a penetration test entails. And so that preparation stage and the training that you mentioned really highlights that is, you get paid to perform a penetration test, but, it doesn't really stop there or
Yeah.
begin there, right? There's a lot that goes into it, and there's a lot, that's underestimated in the context of, performing a penetration test well.
Agreed. I'd also say, I guess, in terms of planning and preparation, I did mention the kickoff meeting earlier, and that is also something that I think is important. So, like during that meeting, I'm trying to get scope. If possible, it's always nice to know beforehand what tech stack am I working with. We're going to find out regardless during the test and during the engagement, but
Mm,
knowing that up front just saves time. And if I can save time on that, that means that that's more time to actually go and break stuff.
right.
Um, I think another thing I like to look for in terms of, specifically in terms of a kickoff meeting and how clients can prepare, having your important workflows identified. Um, just because I think any pen tester will know, you'll run into an instance where you start to pull on a thread and you get really into it and you'll find a lot of stuff only for, to talk to a client and they're like, that's awesome. But what about this? And you're like, I spent a lot of time on this, So I think going ahead and having that conversation up front definitely helps. And then equally in terms of scope, it's not just about what's in scope; it's also specifically about what's out of scope, and especially for web app pen tests, where you're in a situation to where you're going through this application and you have these findings, and then it gets to the point where, okay, well, now maybe they're using a third party service and they're redirected to a completely different site, and you're going to want to pull that thread, but a lot of times you can't. And
Yeah,
so,
and what's the conversation look like, client, with Darrius, with the client when that happens? You identify something, right? And you're like, hey, I think you need to look at more of this. What does that conversation look like?
yeah, so generally it's an email. So if I see something like that, I'm sending an email saying, hey, I've noticed this. It seems to fall out of scope. How do you want to proceed? Depending on what it is. In a lot of cases, it's a case where they're not in control of whatever the third party is. And so unfortunately, there's not much we can do about it other than, they can reach out to the vendor. But if it is something that is under their control, depending on the time frame, we may tweak the scope a little bit.
Yep. Yeah, and that's important because the scope is another one of those things that kind of flies under the radar as being unimportant or not thought of enough, and especially if you're testing a large application with a lot of different components, there's probably a good chance that some stuff is going to be out of scope for that specific engagement. So being aware of those things and communicating that to the client, I think, is really important.
100%. And really it just comes down to documentation. When it comes with a lot of these kickoff meetings, we don't have to have it, but the more that we have, I think, it does kind of result in a better engagement overall. Just because it reduces a little bit of the amount of the finding out period phase, just it reduces that significantly.
Yeah, and it's all about, like you have in the notes, it's all about client value, right? And really getting an understanding of what their goals are, what their needs are, right? Having that conversation with them beforehand to kind of really hone in on what they're looking for to provide value.
100%.
So you sit down in your chair, right?
Yep.
You've got the preparation phase taken care of. You've done that. You've trained up. You've got all of the kind of documentation points from the client set. You sit down in your chair and you start to work on a specific engagement, right? Walk us through kind of, what that looks like, what's your first step, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So the first step for me is, first of all, Obsidian, I set my note taking up. That's kind of the first thing. So within Obsidian, if you're not using it, it's amazing. And there's tons of extensions and things you can do to customize it to you. But I have templates for my web app engagement to kind of help me, organize my thoughts while also making sure that I always kind of check off the box for everything I need to do. So that's definitely the first thing I do. But after that, in terms of getting technical, at the beginning, it's all about recon and mapping out the application. So me personally, the Spencer, I'm an automator. I like to script and all of that. And so I have a process that I run where it's Burp Suite in combination with a Burp Suite extension called Carbonator, which essentially just allows me to run a script. I basically say, hey, target these websites. If I here are the credentials I have, and then boom, that just happens in the background, so I don't have to manually do that, and I can kind of focus on the next steps. Additionally, during this recon and mapping phase, I'm using Wapalizer to figure out, okay, let's see what libraries are in use. And a lot of times that leads to me finding my first finding, which is often, hey, you're using an outdated library. You hear it all the time. jQuery 90% of the time is going to be outdated and it's going to have some vulnerability. So like that's always kind of a quick, easy find on the first day. I'm using Nuclei, which is a CLI web scanner, which I love because you can customize it and there are tons of templates. But I run that to where it automatically scans the site, and based on what it finds, it's looking for common vulnerabilities. I'm using GoBuster to enumerate directories and JavaScript files, and so these are all just kind of low hanging fruits that I want to take care of the first day, so that I ultimately can focus on some of the more complex things. And then generally by the first day, when I'm doing this kind of recon and mapping phase, I'm also kind of doing the beginning of my static analysis, just because you'll be amazed at what you'll find by just viewing the source code. I remember one engagement where it was an Angular JS application, and what they were doing is they're using client-side variables, one, to determine whether or not you were logged in, and two, if you were an admin. And so it was literally just view source. Are you an admin? False. Okay, true. And now I'm an admin. So static analysis is definitely something that I like to kind of get ahead of. I feel like a lot of people, they tend to wait to do that until the end,
Yep.
and you'll just be amazed at what you'll find.
So for those unfamiliar, explain why client side variables are probably not a great idea.
Oh man, so that really gets into the fact that we should just generally, if you're building a web app, you want your validation on the back end. I would probably say that's way more important than on the front end. And what tends to happen is developers put their validation client side only, and then they just have this implicit trust of the backend. Is like, yeah, if it's coming from the client, it's obviously trustworthy because all the validation is supposed to happen there. And that's, in my opinion, is not an efficient way of handling things, because everything client side can be modified, and so that's really the risk there. I think ideally you put it in both places, but what's most important is on the back end.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, and that's an important thing to consider, is how the data can be manipulated across the wire when you're interacting with an app. And I think you were kind of alluding to this in your recon and mapping phase discussion, right? So when you're going through this phase, you're looking for some key things, probably, I would assume, that kind of tell you how the app is constructed, or what the developers were kind of going for in their design. So what are some of the things you're kind of thinking, or what's kind of your thought process for kind of going through that phase and kind of into the next phase of, like, what are the things you're looking for that would be, like a trigger for you to kind of pull on that thread, or, like, what are you looking for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So much to your point, and I'm sure it's I know for a fact it's similar to like internals, where you're trying to get into the mind state of whoever created the application or whoever created the environment. So one, I am looking at, just going back to static analysis, I'm looking at the functions and how you've written the application, because once I kind of get that idea of how you're doing it, if you do it one way here, 9 times out of 10, you're going to do it the same exact way in other places. But specifically, what I'm looking for is, I'm looking for inputs anywhere I can, input data and have it then go off and do something. I think an example I really like is, for example, anytime I see tiny MCE. So for those who don't know, tiny MCE is a very common text editor that developers will add to their site. However, it is also riddled with vulnerabilities in most cases. It can also lead to cross-site scripting. So if I see a tiny MCE box, I instantly get excited, because I'm like, ooh, I'm going to get cross-site scripting. Some other things that I'm looking for in terms of inputs are, what are they doing for validation? So kind of what I was alluding to earlier. Most people, they try to do validation just via JavaScript, which I think is great, but also keep in mind that can be circumvented. In fact, secret fact for those who use Burp Suite, you can actually go into your proxy and you have the option to just click a button that says disable all JavaScript validation. And then boom, there you go. See, something else that I'm looking for is, I'm looking for errors in stack traces. So, it's kind of interesting, because, this is probably the only situation I've ever been in where I'm happy about getting an error. And the reason why I'm excited is because generally when I get an error, a lot of times you'll get a stack trace back, and that really gives you insight into the developers and what they were thinking. Because at that point, you're getting class names, you're getting function names, And a lot of times that can lead to basically further vulnerabilities. So a common example that I've experienced before is I'll get a stack trace and they'll say, hey, there's something funky with this, with this input. And then they'll even show you like, hey, here's the SQL command that's being ran on the back end. Well, the moment I know the exact query, I have SQL injection because now I know exactly how I can manipulate it. I don't have to play the game of trying to blindly figure it out. I have the stack trace. I have that query itself. And it's often something that gets overlooked. A lot of developers struggle with gracefully handling errors. Um, some other things I'm looking for are file uploads and, if I can, and path traversal. That's one of my favorite things to do. And so the reason why I care about this is because, okay, if I can upload a file, a lot of instances I can bypass those file upload controls, whether because it's only validated client side or even in terms of sending it to the back end. A lot of times the controls are really loose. A lot of developers only look for the extensions. And it's like, okay, well, that's great. That's one thing you need to look for. What about the content type? What about the magic bit for the file? All those kind of come into play in terms of, bypassing file uploads. And then kind of the last two things I'll say that I kind of really look for, I look for the use of cloud services. That's because that's extremely important, especially now as more and more developers are kind of shifting to where instead of having, the traditional architecture, they're going to use, AWS Cognito for identity and then S3 buckets for storage. And, that kind of changes your approach to a traditional web app. And so that's something that I'm really interested in seeing and looking for, just because a lot of times it can be exploited. Once again, just going back to static analysis, a lot of times you'll look through the source code and you'll find AWS keys. And so once you have those keys, I'm just going to use the AWS CLI. Now we're in your cloud environment and we're good to go. And the last thing I'll say is I'm also looking for admin functionality. And I guess I didn't mention this earlier, but during the kickoff meeting, something else that's really important is the idea of testing multiple roles. I think that's something that might be a little bit unique to web apps. So, we want to test the admin role as well as a standard user, because you'll be surprised that, you'll have developers that say, oh no, we have proper access controls. But what they're doing is they're just saying, hey, the standard user can't see it. But if a standard user manually navigates to the admin console, well, boom, now they have access. And so that's something else that I'm also that's in my head and that I'm looking for during the engagement.
Yeah. And with the cloud services, I'm curious, just kind of off the wall question. Are there any trends you're seeing with cloud services that are being utilized that you're seeing misconfigured? Obviously, we know like S3 buckets and things like that.
Yep.
Are you seeing any trends of things that clients should look out for when they're standing them up, to be careful with?
So I would say probably two things I would say. So one, I would say is Cognito. So for those who don't know, AWS Cognito, it's basically an identity provider service within AWS. And so what happens is a lot of times from what I've seen is if your app is using AWS Cognito, if you dig around enough, you will eventually find your pool ID, the region that you're in, basically all the information you need to essentially use the AWS CLI to create a user account. And a lot of time that may not seem like a big deal, but if your Cognito pools are misconfigured, you may run into an instance to where you may not know that a user in a certain pool actually has AWS permissions. So you may have the ability to log into the console or to read from an S3 bucket or any S3 bucket for that matter. And so that's something that I often see in terms of misconfigured Cognito policies and permissions and things of that nature. I think it's kind of the second thing that I think is kind of interesting, specifically for apps that are running on EC2 instances, is this concept of when you're working in the cloud, we're used to thinking of identity as a user, where in the cloud, it's not just the user. Resources are also an identity, and they also have their own sets of permissions. And so a lot of time I've been able to do this, a few times where if I can get the app to get the server to reach out to its metadata service, I can potentially pull session keys. And if I can pull those session keys, I now am masquerading as the identity of the EC2 instance, which means now I can do anything via the AWS console as that server. And so a lot of times that, especially for like older applications that have been running for a long time, it's misconfigured. It was someone stood it up and gave it super admin permissions to everything in AWS because they just needed it to work. And so that's something else that I think we commonly see.
That sounds pretty bad.
Just a little bit, just
So,
just a little bit.
I was thinking of this question in my head and I didn't want to forget it, so I'll say it now.
Yeah.
What's your favorite part of this process, right? Of the web app pen testing process, what is your favorite part?
Yeah. So I think my favorite part, and I guess this kind of ties into, I guess, post exploitation, is the POC generation. So I talked a little bit earlier about some of these tools that I'm using, and those tools are great for like finding common things. But really, when it comes down to it, in terms of before I even put a finding in the report, I want to create a proof of concept. And so my criteria for that is, one, I want it to be able to showcase the severity, but two, I want to make sure that it's repeatable for the client. There's nothing more, embarrassing than saying like, "Hey, I did this and I have the screenshots, but I can't do it again." So those are my two
Or not,
criteria.
or just saying, hey, I did this thing, but not even having any evidence to support it, right? Like, here's the
Exactly.
thing, like,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's even worse. Which, luckily, with Burp Suite, you do it right, you always have a history of your request. But proof of concept creation is probably my favorite part, hands down. So to kind of give an example of that, I was working on a web app, found an SS. Burp was like, "Hey, we think this is an SSRF vulnerability." And so basically, what that means, for those who don't know, is Burp is basically saying, "Hey, we were able to get this web app to basically reach out to this other server that we control." And so I love finding that because that's one, it's pretty easy to validate, right? So I will spin up a request bin, and then I'll basically try the request out to say, "Hey, can I get this server to talk to my request bin?" And so in this particular example, the answer was yes. And what was really cool is that this particular vulnerability was on a download endpoint. So, they're basically, users would go to download files from this particular web app. You can also basically get the web app to include any additional file from any source to be included in the zip file, which is huge because now we're looking at remote file inclusion on top of the SSRF. And then on top of that, we could, now we start to think, okay, well, if I have remote file inclusion, can I get local file inclusion? And so it just kind of went from there. And so building out that proof of concept of, like, it first started out as, "Hey, can I like package, some malware into, the zip file that a user is downloading?" It started out with that, and then it just turned into something else. And so that's probably my favorite part.
And how often would you say are the vulnerabilities that you discover a result of things that have been chained together, as opposed to like a single finding?
I would probably say maybe 60% of the time. It really just depends on how the web app is designed. Um, but yeah, especially in terms of chaining attacks, I find that a lot especially in terms of business logic failure, to where, okay, there's the app has this workflow in a specific process, but by doing step 3 before doing step 1, it acts a certain way, and then it just kind of chains together from there.
Yeah. So post exploitation, you talked about POC being kind of your favorite stage. I think anyone who's in pen testing likes exploit creation, and I think that's a really fun and interactive part of offensive security. Is like, I wrote this exploit that does this thing, and I think that's a really fun part. But what's kind of your process, right, for kind of validating it? Speak to a little bit about showcasing the vulnerability, showing the impact. why it's important for it to be repeatable for the client and that kind of thing.
Okay. So I guess, like I said, my process is, once I find it, I want to figure out the full severity of it and kind of get a handle on it. Um, from there, I will say it does kind of fall back to the kickoff meeting a little bit, to where, ideally we've had those talks about what's important, what not to touch. So I'm going to try to, try to create a proof of concept that kind of falls in line with what the client wants. So, if you say, hey, we're really concerned about you being able to access um, customer healthcare data, and I find a vulnerability to where I'm able to enumerate, you know, healthcare data via, maybe, documents, being able to enumerate doc IDs. That's a relatively easy proof of concept to show off. It's like, hey, I'm just going 1 through 100. Look at all this healthcare information I got. That it's really about, like I said, meeting the client with where they're at.
Mhm.
Additionally, in terms of that process, I like to do a couple of different things. So either one, I am I'm making copies and taking screenshots of their actual requests made. And so that way, whenever I give it, whenever the client sees it, it's like, hey, here's the actual request. And you can then go take that request and put it into, any tool you want. And, you're able to now recreate it. Um, Sometimes I'll create a video to kind of showcase a vulnerability, and that clients tend to like that. And then kind of the last thing I'll do is, if possible, in fact, I've done it recently for an engagement where it's like, hey, it was a cross-site request vulnerability. Um, so here's the actual, HTML file that will exploit said vulnerability. All you have to do is log in and then open up this page, and then boom, it works. So I think things like that, that's generally how I try to approach it. Um,
So what you're
and
saying is you don't just copy an exploit off of exploit DB or run an
no,
exploit module and take a screenshot and call it a day.
no, not all the time. I'm hard headed, so I will maybe gain inspiration, but I like to kind of do things from scratch where possible.
Oh,
Um,
you're one of those people that likes to know the code that you're running before you run it.
yes,
Oh, I
yeah,
see.
yeah, yeah. um, yeah. That's kind of where my mind goes. And I try to also have fun with it a little bit too, when possible. So I remember one of the first web app engagements I ever had. There was a cross-site request. There was a cross-site scripting vulnerability, and so there's a common way to kind of show the severity of that. Is this? I can't remember the developer's name, but it's basically a hook called Harlem Shake, where you're able to leverage this vulnerability to get the entire web app to dance to Harlem Shake. And so that's, when possible, I think it's, have a little bit of fun with it is awesome.
Hey, if we're not having fun, what are we doing, right?
Exactly.
So I think that one of the last kind of sections here of the episode is challenges,
Yep.
and things you've had to overcome, things that get in your way, issues you've had to tackle. So talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges of web app pen testing, of the process of the pen testing methodology for pen testing web apps, or kind of anything in between there.
Okay. So I will say one of the first challenges, and the thing that really it hurts, as a pen tester whenever you experience it, is knowing a web app is vulnerable to something, but you can't exploit it because of a web application firewall. So it's this tough situation of like trying to explain to a client, hey, your web app is vulnerable. Cloudflare is preventing me from, using some common, exploits against it, which is great,
Mhm.
but it's still vulnerable. And so trying to have that conversation and explain to them, and sometimes even convince them, like, hey, let's remove the WAF from the equation so I can show this to you. That's something that is often a challenge,
Yeah.
just because, if you're pressed for time. And so
Yep.
it's like, I could spend a whole entire week trying out different ways to bypass Cloudflare, or we could
Yep.
just remove it, or we can just like accept the fact that, hey, I have enough, here's some proof to showcase that it is vulnerable. Let's
Yeah.
fix it.
Like a lot of things with bypasses, right? Like EDR bypasses or any other security product, right? It's like at some point, we have a limited time engagement, and we can spend that time fuzzing or enumerating or just more or less just trying to bypass that thing or that control. But at some point, yeah, it's a good idea for everyone to kind of come together and say, yeah, we agree. Let's figure out how to move past this or kind of get beyond this, so that we're not spinning our wheels on something that maybe is more or less a futile effort, right? Because you could come up with a bypass and that gets patched, and then you can come up with another bypass and then that gets patched, and
Yep,
it's an
cat and
endless
mouse.
cycle. Yeah, exactly.
Some other common challenges are locking out accounts. So that's one thing that I've started doing is like, hey, let's just go ahead and get 2 admin accounts. So when I inevitably lock out both my admin and my standard user, I'm not having to reach out to you. And so that's something else. Something else that's also kind of a challenge, especially in terms of dealing with API pen tests specifically, is APIs not being documented. Um, if you are as the developer, I highly recommend, if you're not doing it, you should know every single endpoint that you have. I just think point blank. If you don't, I just feel like you're doing something wrong. You should know what you have out there. And so obviously we're going to do our best effort to find everything, and we do a good job of that. But there's always that in the back of my head, did I find everything? And so having your APIs documented or not having your APIs documented is definitely a challenge. Um, and then I guess I will end kind of the last kind of major challenge, I would say, is probably keeping up with kind of all the new frameworks that pop up. Um, JavaScript is ever evolving. It seems like there's always a new JavaScript framework. And so it's like every time a new one comes out, and it's like, oh, this is the next big thing that developers are moving to. And it's just like, another one to learn. So that can be a challenge as well.
Yeah, it's tough, right? It goes back to, my point at the beginning of the episode that there's a lot that goes into pen testing that a lot of people don't appreciate or don't realize, for those who don't do it every day. And, just keeping up with the current state of security and threats, and, security products and the 0 days and the vulnerabilities in them and bypasses and things like that, is a full-time job in and of itself, combined with everything else.
100%.
Cool. So anything else? Anything else we missed? Anything else that you want to mention for this episode before we wrap up?
No, I think that covers it. I guess I'll just say, hey, this was definitely kind of a snapshot in terms of the life of a day of an engagement. But if anyone wants to talk more about what it's like or just web apps in general, feel free to reach out. I think we have LinkedIn, and we have our social media tags kind of available. So I love talking about this stuff and love to see some community involvement.
Definitely. And, like you were saying, this is really just scratching the surface of things that go into it. But hopefully this kind of gives you a behind the scenes look at, a web app pen test and what somebody who does web app pen testing day in, day out is kind of looking for, how they think, how they operate. So hopefully that was valuable to you folks. If you did find value in this, we'd appreciate it if you would share the episode with your colleagues, with your network, share it on LinkedIn or Twitter or wherever you kind of consume your social media. You can check us out on offsec.blog and at securit360.com. And my last right hook, my last call to action would be head on over to our YouTube page and to our podcast page and subscribe to those if you're not. We release new episodes every Wednesday. We're putting out a bunch of content on LinkedIn, on our blog. So definitely check us out there. And if you enjoyed it, let us know. We'd love to hear some feedback, things you'd like to see, new episode ideas, or anything in between. So with that, we will see you all next time.